September 15, 1944, Camp Barkley, Texas. Elite German officers, trained to view Americans as soft and unworthy enemies, stepped off transport trucks into the vast, dusty plains of West Texas, expecting chains, squalor, and vengeful guards. What they encountered instead was a quiet order that began to quietly erode the walls of their Nazi-forged certainty. One small oversight in their propaganda-laced worldview would soon spark questions they had never dared to ask. By the time the sun dipped low over the horizon, a few among them already sensed that the real captivity might lie deeper than any fence. The dust of Texas settled on their polished boots as the truck doors swung open, revealing rows of neat, tar paper-covered barracks stretching out under a wide blue sky. Major Klaus Ritter, a veteran tank commander from an SS Panzer division captured just weeks earlier during the fierce fighting in Normandy, straightened his uniform and scanned the scene with a practiced sneer. He had led his crew through the hedgerows of France, believing every American advance was a fluke born of endless supplies rather than skill. And now here he was, one of hundreds funneled into this remote outpost after a long rail journey across the Atlantic and then by truck from New York. The camp, activated earlier that year as part of the sprawling U.S. network that would eventually hold over 425,000 Axis prisoners by war's end, looked more like a training base than a dungeon. Double barbed wire fences encircled the grounds, but there were no snarling dogs or floodlit patrols in sight yet. Just a handful of American soldiers in olive drab, directing the new arrivals with clipped efficiency. Ritter fell into line with about 50 other officers, mostly from the Wehrmacht and SS like himself, their ranks preserved under the rules of the Geneva Convention that both sides claimed to honor. As they marched toward the processing area, past low wooden buildings that housed up to 840 Germans at the camp's peak, he muttered to Captain Heinrich Voss beside him about the primitive setup. No grand stone walls like the fortresses back home, just these flimsy structures that a good artillery barrage could flatten in minutes. In his mind flashed images from the training films. Americans as convention meant fair treatment, as long as they followed camp rules. Simple words, but they hung in the air like an unwelcome truth. Ritter had braced for interrogations laced with threats, stories from captured comrades painting the Yankees as brutal opportunists eager for payback. Instead, the man just pointed them toward the barracks, assigning bunks in a way that kept officers separate from the enlisted men, respecting their command structure as if it still mattered. Inside the first building, the air was stuffy but clean. Rows of canvas cots lined up with wool blankets folded neatly at the foot, far from the mud and lice of the front lines, yet Ritter's lip curled at the sight. He claimed a spot by the window, overlooking the flat expanse where sentries paced lazily, and unpacked his few allowed items: a change of underwear, a worn copy of Mein Kampf that he clutched like a talisman. Voss joined him, whispering about escape plans already forming in hushed tones among the group, their pride demanding they not rot here while the fatherland fought on. But as the afternoon wore on and the heat built, a quiet unease settled in Ritter's chest. Not fear, exactly, but the first faint crack in the armor of certainty he'd worn since joining the SS as a young idealist. Propaganda had promised a decadent foe, crumbling under their own excess. Yet this place hummed with a purpose that felt almost efficient. What none of them knew yet was how the simplest routines would test that arrogance further. As evening fell, the call came for the first meal, and the guards wheeled in carts that carried scents wafting through the open doors, promises of something far removed from the watery stew and hard bread of their last days in combat. A simple tray slid under the door, carrying smells that no German field kitchen could ever match. Warm bread and something sweet, mingling in the air like a memory from before the ration cards ruled every bite. Major Ritter paused in his pacing, the day's heat still clinging to his skin, as the guards distributed the evening meal to each officer in turn. No chaos or favoritism in the line. The portions came on sturdy tin plates, thick slices of supply shortages. Simple put, the convention was an agreement from 1929 that set rules for how prisoners should be treated, ensuring they got enough to eat and stay healthy, much like any soldier in uniform. Ritter broke off a piece of the chocolate first, the snap of it loud in the quiet room, and let it melt on his tongue, the rich, creamy taste flooding back to a boyhood in Munich, before the speeches and the uniforms turned everything sharp and gray. He had been told endless stories in the barracks and briefings. The Americans were starving their own people, their economy a house of cards ready to collapse, fighting only because they drowned the world in cheap goods stolen from weaker nations. Yet here was proof otherwise, solid and sweet, enough for every man in the room without a fight over scraps. And as Voss across the way savored his own share, a low murmur rippled through the group, half complaints about the decadence, half unspoken wonder at how such plenty could exist while Europe burned. For Ritter, that single bar wasn't just food. It was a whisper against the grand narratives drilled into him since officer school, the kind that said the Reich's will alone would outlast any material edge. And now that edge felt like a chasm. They ate in near silence at first, the stew hearty with real meat and potatoes, not the sawdust fillers that had become standard back home, where civilians queued for hours for a loaf that barely filled the stomach. One lieutenant, a former Luftwaffe pilot with scars from the Battle of Britain, pocketed his chocolate uneasily, muttering that it must be a trick to lower their guard before the real hardships began. But Ritter finished his meal feeling fuller than he had in months, the coffee's warmth settling in his chest like an unwelcome comfort. Stirring a flicker of doubt, he pushed down quickly. After all, this was temporary, a Yankee ploy to boast their superiority. Still, as the trays were collected and the lights dimmed for the night, he lay back on the clean blanket, the cot surprisingly soft compared to the frozen trenches, and stared at the wooden slats above. Clean beds waited after the meal, but sleep brought uneasy dreams of homes growing shortages, families huddled over meager fires, whispers of defeat creeping in from the east. And Ritter woke before the men lined up under the watchful eyes of guards who kept a professional distance, counting heads without the usual prods or curses. After that came the showers, a block of simple concrete stalls with hot water piped in from boilers that ran without fail, even in the Texas chill that could sneak up before dawn. And each officer received a fresh bar of soap and towel upon entering, part of the weekly hygiene kits the U.S. Army provided to all 425,000 Axis prisoners spread across its camps, a measure that kept disease rates near zero compared to the outbreaks that plagued overcrowded Axis facilities. Ritter stepped under the spray first, the steam rising around him as he lathered up, the soap's clean lather cutting through the lingering dirt from the journey without the harsh sting of wartime substitutes made from recycled fats. Simple as it was, that bar in his hand became a quiet symbol, scrubbing away not just the grime of travel, but nudging at the edges of his beliefs about a West drowning in laziness and waste. How could a nation at war afford such basics for its enemies, when their own people back home shared one bar among a family for a month? The water ran hot and steady, a luxury Ritter hadn't known since leave in Berlin 2 years back. And as he dried off with the coarse but clean towel, he caught Voss's eye in the mirror of sorts, a polished tin sheet. Both men looking a bit less worn, their uniforms hanging neatly in lockers that locked with American-made padlocks. Breakfast followed in the mess hall, another spread of oatmeal, fresh fruit like oranges from distant groves, and more of that strong coffee, with seconds offered freely to those who asked. reinforcing the camp's capacity to house up to 3,000 men like them at Camp Barkley, without the chaos of hunger riots that rumors said plagued Soviet camps. For Ritter, the routine chipped away subtly. He had been taught that the Allies' strength lay in numbers alone, not in this kind of quiet care. And now, watching a guard nod approval as he returned his tray, a flicker of confusion stirred. Was this respect a weakness, or something far stronger that the Reich's fire and steel doctrine could never match? By midday, after a brief work detail assigning officers to light clerical tasks that preserved their dignity under ever more desperate, painting pictures of empty shelves and flickering hopes that would only widen the gap between what Ritter knew and what he was starting to see. A thin envelope from Berlin arrived during the afternoon mail call, its paper worn thin by Sensor's hands, carrying the weight of the Führer's promises that still echoed in every line from home. Major Ritter's name was called out by a guard with a neutral tone, and he took the letter to a quiet corner of the yard, the Texas sun warming the bench as he slit it open carefully. The words were from his wife, Greta, scribbled in hurried script about the latest air raid that had shattered windows 2 streets over, and how the neighborhood now shared a single loaf among 4 families, the baker's ovens running on whispers of flour from the east. She mentioned the children asking for chocolate, a treat rarer than meat these days, and ended with a clipped assurance that the Reich's scientists would turn the tide soon. Just hold faith. This was the reality of mail in the camps. The U.S. Army reviewed every piece for security, blacking out details that might aid escapes or reveal troop movements, but they processed over 1 million letters monthly to keep families connected, a far cry from the silence that swallowed many on the Eastern Front. Ritter folded the page, the contrast hitting like a cold wind. Here he had savored real chocolate just hours ago, while back in the fatherland, such luxuries were myths peddled in old newsreels to rally the weary. As he sat there, the envelope trembling slightly in his grip, the propaganda that had shaped his world since the 1930s began to fray at the edges. He had marched into France believing the American war machine was a fragile giant, bloated on borrowed strength. Yet Greta's words painted a homeland crumbling under its own weight, factories bombed, fields unplanted, while this camp ran like clockwork with enough for all. Voss joined him, sharing his own letter from a sister in Hamburg, describing lines for ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt wood. And for the first time, their whispers turned not to escape plots, but to quiet questions. How could the Reich, with its superior blood and will, starve while the enemy fed its prisoners better than civilians? It wasn't rage that stirred a steaming cup of coffee from a thermos on the table. Major Ritter stood at attention as the door clicked shut behind him, the room spare but lit steadily with a desk lamp that cast no harsh shadows, far from the dimly lit cells of Gestapo tales that haunted his thoughts. The officer, a man in his 30s named Harlan, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a notebook in hand, gestured for Ritter to sit, his English clear and unhurried as he explained the session would last about 30 minutes, focused on unit details to help both sides understand the war's shape. This was standard procedure in U.S. POW camps like Barkley, where intelligence gathering relied on psychology and patience rather than force, and records from the Red Cross later showed that only about 1% of the 425,000 held Axis prisoners reported any mistreatment, a stark contrast to the rumors of beatings that circulated in German ranks. Harlan asked first about Ritter's Panzer Division, jotting notes on tactics used in Normandy without pressing for secrets that might endanger comrades, even sliding the coffee across, real beans, not the acorn substitute Ritter had endured for months. As the questions flowed, polite and precise, Ritter found himself answering more freely than expected, the captain's nod of understanding like a conversation among professionals, rather than a trap set by victors gloating over the fallen. He had prepared in the transport for snarls and demands, visions fueled by SS breathings of Yankee interrogators as crude thugs hungry for revenge. Yet here was this man treating him as an equal, respecting the uniform even as it represented a crumbling regime. The respect disarmed Ritter like a sudden ceasefire. Doubts from the mail and meals deepened into a brewing storm within, forcing him to see the American not as a faceless enemy, but as a soldier much like himself, competent and calm, which clashed violently with the ideology that had defined his life. How could the inferior race show such poise while the Reich's elite faltered? When the session ended, Harlan stood and shook Ritter's hand, a firm grip without triumph, saying simply that he'd likely see him around the camp for any follow-ups, then opened the door to the yard where the evening brief Life magazine or borrowed books from the camp's collection, all part of the U.S. Army's education program that aimed to keep minds occupied and spirits steady during confinement. He picked up a copy of the Saturday Evening Post first, the cover showing a family picnic under shady oaks, their table laden with hams and pies that made his stomach twist in memory of the letter from home. As he turned the pages, images jumped out. Rows of shiny cars parked outside supermarkets bursting with canned goods, shelves of canned fruits and fresh breads that no ration stamp could claim, and families in neat homes with lights burning bright into the night, electricity without the blackouts that had become routine in Germany. By 1945, over 80% of the prisoners in such camps would attend these informal classes or library sessions, learning English or even taking correspondence courses in trades, a system designed not just for control, but to prepare men for life after the war, though to Ritter, it felt like a window cracked open on the enemy's hidden strength. These weren't the faded propaganda sketches of a crumbling America he'd studied. They were vivid proofs of a society built on abundance, where the war seemed to strain resources without breaking them, and the casual photos of GIs at drive-ins or baseball games painted soldiers as ordinary men, enjoying freedoms the Reich had promised, but never delivered. Ritter sank into a worn chair, the magazine heavy in his lap, as envy crept in like the evening chill. A sharp pang for the life his children might have known if the path had been different, clashing with the lessons of superiority drilled into him since youth. He had sneered at American culture as shallow, a distraction from true discipline. Yet these pages shattered that myth quietly, showing a nation that fought not from desperation, but from a deep well of plenty, making the SS ideals feel brittle and hollow in comparison. Voss leaned over, pointing to an article on wartime factories churning out planes like toys, and for a moment they both stared in silence, the words blurring as the reality sank in. This was the industrial might that had outproduced the Reich at every turn. When the library bell rang for lights out, Ritter returned the magazine with reluctant hands, his thoughts tangled in the pictures that lingered like ghosts. Stepping into barracks paired off against the Americans, the ball bouncing under the relentless Texas sun in a match that started as a way to burn off steam, but quickly turned into something more unexpected. The field, a flat patch of packed earth with goals marked by crates, served as one of the camp's recreation areas, where physical activity was encouraged daily to maintain health and morale among the prisoners, complete with basic equipment like bats and nets provided by the Army, efforts that helped drop injury rates by about 50% compared to idle confinement in other wartime setups. Ritter watched as Voss took a pass, his shot sailing wide but earning a good-natured clap from an American corporal who then dribbled past two Germans with easy skill, the game flowing without referees or grudges, just shouts in broken English and German mixing like old comrades on a village green. No one cheated or taunted. The guards played as equals, sweating in their uniforms, and when the ball came Ritter's way, he trapped it instinctively, his old academy training kicking in as he weaved through a defender and scored, the cheer from both sides pulling a rare, stiff smile to his face. In that moment, with the dust kicking up around his boots and laughter echoing for the first time since Normandy, Ritter felt the human side of the enemy break through the propaganda haze. These weren't the monsters of the films, but men who valued fair play and shared the same ache after a hard run, much like the soldiers he'd led in easier days. It humanized them all too quickly, stirring memories of SS drills where rivalry was beaten into hatred. Yet here, the game dissolved that into something simple and true, leaving Ritter's indoctrination feeling like a faded echo, hollow against the real bonds forming on the field. As the whistle blew to end the hour, sweat-soaked and breathing hard, he shook hands with the corporal who'd let him score, the grip warm and without irony, planting a seed of connection that made the fences around the camp seem a little less absolute. The day wound down with the men buzzing about the match, ties of unexpected respect lingering as evening fell. But with November nearing, the calendar promised holidays that would test those bonds even deeper, amplifying every contrast between the world inside and the one they'd left behind. Turkeys roasted in butter and even pumpkin pies sliced into generous wedges for each man. Extras beyond the standard rations that made the officers exchange glances, their plates heaped higher than on any ordinary evening. This was Thanksgiving, a yearly custom in the United States to give thanks for the harvest and the year's blessings, and the Army extended it to the camps, feeding over 400,000 prisoners nationwide that year with meals that echoed the home front's plenty, all while adhering to the Geneva Convention's call for fair treatment without favoritism or fanfare. Ritter took his seat between Voss and the Luftwaffe lieutenant, forking into the tender meat that flaked easily, the flavors rich and unfamiliar after months of tinned fare, while around them the room filled with the low hum of conversation in multiple tongues, guards joining at separate tables but sharing the same air without division. As the pie dissolved sweet and spiced on his tongue, Ritter's mind wandered to his family's Christmas back in Berlin, a shadow of gatherings past with thin soup and pine branches for a tree, the holiday strained by alerts and shortages that no amount of resolve could fill. The generosity here washed over him like the warm hall itself. Why pour such effort into feeding foes when the war raged on, missiles falling on their own cities? It overwhelmed the careful walls he'd built, the Nazi creed of scarcity as virtue crumbling against this quiet display of a nation that could afford to share even with the vanquished, stirring a deeper fracture in his beliefs where pride once stood firm. No speeches or toasts demanded loyalty. It was the act alone that spoke, turning the meal into a mirror reflecting the Reich's isolation. And Ritter pushed his empty plate away, feeling not just full, but strangely adrift in the face of such unforced kindness. The meal ended with coffee and faint music from a radio in the corner, American tunes that spoke of home and hearth, leaving the officers to linger in the yard as dusk fell, their steps heavier with thoughts unspoken. Whispers among the officers grew in the evenings that followed, turning the barracks into a space where forbidden questions about the war's true course began to take shape. In the shadows of the barracks after lights out, voices lowered to hushed murmurs as men get official line called strategic withdrawals. These late-night talks were common in the camps, where secret groups sometimes formed, pro-Nazi cells plotting resistance or escapes. But as the months wore on, many dissolved under the weight of shared evidence, with historical records showing that by early 1945, around 20% of the officer prisoners had openly renounced their Nazi ties or distanced themselves, swayed by the flood of Allied newsreels and personal realizations that chipped away at the regime's grip. Ritter listened as the discussion turned to the chocolate and clean sheets, simple things that spoke of a war machine fueled by more than ideology. And one by one, the men admitted the cracks in their beliefs, the propaganda that painted the enemy as doomed, now feeling like a veil torn by the very abundance around them. For Ritter, the shift came as peer pressure flipped. Instead of the old pressure to stand firm, It was now a collective exhale, voices weaving doubts into a tapestry that mirrored his own turmoil, forcing him to confront how the SS oaths that once burned bright now left a bitter ash in his mouth. The world view shattered, not by force, but by the quiet proof that another way had prevailed long before the last shot. The group fell silent as footsteps patrolled outside, but the questions hung heavy, binding them in a new kind of unity that no command could break. One particular event in the coming days would seal this change for many, pushing Ritter to the edge of everything he'd held true. Rain pounded the tin roof of the infirmary like distant artillery, turning the Texas dust to mud outside as Major Ritter clutched his side, the old shrapnel wound from Normandy flaring up after a clumsy step during the evening's rain-slicked walk. He had ignored the twinge at first, pride keeping him from the camp medic, but as the pain sharpened and fever set in, a guard noticed his limp and directed him to the small clinic building, one of the clean wooden structures that served as the heart of medical care in the sprawling setup. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and fresh linens, a far cry from the field hospitals he'd known, where surgeons worked by lantern light amid the screams of the dying. The American doctor, a middle-aged man from Ohio with steady hands, examined Ritter without a word of judgment. Probing the scar bandaged it with fresh gauze, Ritter sat rigid on the exam table, expecting the usual brusqueness of victors toward the defeated. But instead, the doctor patted his shoulder gently after the procedure, saying in accented German, "You'll be good as new by morning," and handed him a pack of cigarettes along with a Red Cross parcel that had arrived earlier, its Red Cross emblem unassuming, but contents spilling out like a quiet bounty. Ritter stared at the parcel's gifts as the rain drummed on: a bar of Hershey's chocolate, a tin of canned peaches, fresh socks without holes, and a small bar of soap still wrapped. Simple items that in the Reich would fetch a month's pay on the black market, yet here they were, standard issue for recovery. The nurse left him to rest in a curtained cot, the morphine dulling the pain but sharpening his thoughts. And as he unwrapped the chocolate, breaking off a square that melted warm and bittersweet, the flood came unbidden. Tears tracing paths down his cheeks, silent at first, then shaking his frame as the sweetness unlocked the dam. This wasn't just the treat, it was the symbol crashing down. The endless factories of America that outpoured such abundance while the fatherland scraped for fuel. The respect from a doctor who saw him as a man, not a monster, unraveling the lies he'd sworn to since youth. The SS Brotherhood that preached purity and conquest, now exposed as a brittle shell against this unyielding humanity. In that moment, alone with the rain's rhythm, Ritter wept for the boy he'd been, twisted by rallies and uniforms into a cog of hate, for the war's waste that had stolen years and lives, and for the awakening that the real defeat had happened in boardrooms and farms long before the fields of France. The chocolate's wrapper crinkling in his fist like the last shred of his old world. The doctor checked on him later, offering no comment on the damp pillow, just a nod and more water, his care a quiet anchor that sealed Ritter's rejection of the poison ideology, leaving him hollow but free in a way the camp's fences could never touch. Months blurred in the wake of that night, the lessons of Barclay weaving into the fabric of daily life, tending the camp's vegetable patch, tasks that gave purpose amid the waiting and allowed glimpses of American work ethic up close, from guards who shared tools without suspicion. Repatriation loomed on the horizon, with most of the 425,000 Axis prisoners like them slated for release by 1946, once the peace treaties took hold. Many carrying home not just memories, but quiet shifts in outlook, as post-war accounts revealed how the exposure to fair treatment had turned a portion of the captured elite against the extremes of their past allegiances. Ritter found himself in those groups, his hands calloused from helping repair a fence one afternoon. The work drawing nods from the very men who'd once been his foes. And in those moments, the disorientation settled like dust after a storm. Half regret for the years lost to blind faith, half a wary gratitude for the humanity that had pried his eyes open. Plenty and respect had won the inner war without a shot, he pondered during quiet evenings by the library window. The chocolate bar's wrapper long discarded, but its taste a reminder that ideologies crumbled fastest against simple acts of decency, leaving him adrift, yet clearer than before, pondering the families waiting across the ocean, and the world he'd returned to, reshaped. The camp's routines continued unbroken, letters flowing steadier now with hints of victory in the air, binding the men in a fragile peace that no escape tunnel could match. As the war's end drew near in the spring of 1945, stories like Ritter's slipped into the folds of history, whispers among the repatriated that spoke volumes about the quiet victories beyond the battlefields. In the end, these officers learned that true defeat came not from bullets or battles, but from the steady light of a different way of life, one built on respect, abundance, and shared humanity that outlasted any creed of conquest. Their sneers faded to thoughtful silences, and those silences to a hard-won understanding, showing how fragile our deepest beliefs can be when simple truths come into view. If stories like this draw you closer to the human heart of history, consider subscribing for more such tales.